She can't even walk with that body. They mocked Obese Girl, and Mountain Man made them eat dirt. The town of Redemption Creek sat nestled in the Wyoming territory like a handful of wooden dice tossed carelessly onto the prairie. It was the autumn of 1823, and the settlement had grown prosperous enough to boast a proper meeting hall, a sturdy log structure with real glass windows shipped all the way from St. Louis. Tonight, that hall blazed with lamplight and rang with fiddle music, for it was the night of the harvest dance. Eliza May Thornton stood at the edge of the crowded room, her hands folded carefully over the folds of her best calico dress. She had spent 3 months sewing it, letting out seams and adding panels until it fit her generous frame. At 22 years old, Eliza carried her weight the way the mountains carried snow, abundantly and without apology. Her face was round and pleasant, with warm brown eyes that missed nothing, and a smile that came easily, though tonight it wavered at the corners. She had come to the dance with her younger brother Samuel, who had already disappeared into the throng of dancers. Eliza told herself she was content to watch, to tap her foot to the lively reels and jigs, to admire the swirl of skirts and the stomp of boots. But deep in her heart, she longed to feel the music in her bones, to let it carry her across the floor the way it carried everyone else. "Lord have mercy," a voice cut through the music like a knife through butter. Did someone roll a prairie schooner into the hall? Eliza's smile froze. She knew that voice. Thomas Pritchard, the banker's son, a man whose good looks were matched only by his cruelty. "That ain't no wagon, Tom," his companion Silas Granger laughed. "That's Eliza Thornton, though I reckon she could haul as much freight." The men clustered near the punch bowl, their faces flushed with whiskey and malice. There were 5 of them, Pritchard, Granger, and 3 cowboys from the Rocking H Ranch who had ridden in for the festivities. Their laughter rolled across the room like thunder before a storm. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. She took a step backward, thinking to slip out the side door, but Thomas Pritchard had spotted her movement. "Now don't run off, Miss Eliza," he called out, loud enough that dancers began to slow and turn. "We were just wondering if you came here to dance or to test the strength of the floorboards." More laughter. A few of the townspeople looked away uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. That was the way of things in small settlements. Thomas Pritchard's father held the mortgage on half the businesses in Redemption Creek, and folks were careful not to cross him or his kin. "I heard tell," Silas Granger added, emboldened by the attention, "that she can't even walk properly under all that weight. Imagine asking her to dance. You'd need a team of oxen to get her moving." Eliza's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She'd endured such comments before, though never quite so publicly. She lifted her chin and turned toward the door, dignity wrapped around her like a cloak. That's when the door burst open. The man who filled the doorway was a giant. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the lamplight behind him. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt made of elk hide, both darkened with wear and weather. His beard was thick and black, shot through with premature silver, and his eyes were the pale blue of glacier ice. A long rifle rested in the crook of his arm, and a knife the size of a small sword hung at his belt. The music stuttered to a halt. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew of Jeremiah Cole, though few had seen him up close. He was a mountain man, one of those wild trappers who spent months alone in the high country, living off the land and trading furs once or twice a year. The stories about him were legendary. How he'd once killed a grizzly bear with just his knife, how he'd survived a winter trapped in a cave, how he could track a man across bare rock. Jeremiah's ice-blue eyes swept the room, taking in the frozen dancers, the fiddle player with his bow held aloft and finally settling on the cluster of men near the punch bowl. Then his gaze moved to Eliza, still standing with her hand on the doorframe, clearly moments from fleeing. "Mighty fancy gathering," Jeremiah said, his voice a low rumble like distant avalanche. He stepped fully into the room, and people instinctively moved aside. "Heard the music from 2 miles out. Figured I'd see what civilization looks like these days." Thomas Pritchard recovered his composure first, though his smile was strained. "Mr. Cole, isn't it? Welcome." though I'm afraid this is a private dance for the townspeople. Seemed like you were having a public conversation just now, Jeremiah interrupted, his eyes still on Eliza. Something about dancing and floorboards and oxen. Care to repeat it? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas Granger suddenly found his boots fascinating, while the three cowboys began edging toward the opposite door. We were just having a bit of fun, Thomas said, though his voice had lost its swagger. No harm meant. Fun! Jeremiah tasted the word like it was spoiled meat. He set his rifle carefully against the wall and walked toward Eliza with surprising grace for a man of his size. When he reached her, he swept off his fur cap and offered a small bow. Miss, he said quietly, I'm no gentleman, and I've spent more time with bears than people. But would you do me the honor of a dance? Eliza stared at him, her heart hammering. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his hands and forearms, the weathered creases around his eyes, the quiet strength in his stance. She could also see something unexpected. Kindness. I don't think that's, she began. Eve. In fact, Jeremiah said, raising his voice so it carried to every corner of the hall, I'll make a wager. I say this lady here can dance better than any man in this room. Anyone care to bet against me? The silence was profound. Then Thomas Pritchard laughed, though it sounded forced. That's absurd. She can barely walk, let alone— $100 in gold, Jeremiah said flatly. That's my wager. Put up or shut up. $100 was more than most men in the room made in 6 months. Thomas Pritchard's eyes glittered with greed and spite. You're serious? As a heart attack? Then you have a bet, Mr. Cole. Thomas pulled a leather purse from his coat. But when you lose, I expect payment before you slink back to your cave. Jeremiah didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Eliza and offered his hand. Miss, will you? Eliza felt the weight of every eye in the room. She thought about refusing, about fleeing into the night and never coming back. But something in Jeremiah Cole's steady gaze gave her courage. This man, this stranger, was willing to risk a fortune on her. The least she could do was try. She placed her hand in his, and it disappeared into his enormous palm. I don't want you to lose your money on my account, she whispered. The corner of his mouth quirked up. Then we'd better make sure I don't. He led her to the center of the floor. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, forming a circle around them. The fiddle player looked uncertain until Jeremiah nodded to him. Something with spirit, the mountain man said. The fiddler tucked his instrument under his chin and began to play, a lively Virginia reel that had feet tapping despite the tension. Jeremiah bowed formally to Eliza, and she curtsied in return, her heart in her throat. Then the dance began. Eliza had learned to dance from her mother back in Virginia before the family had made their way west. In those days, before grief and hardship and the strange expansion of her body that came with womanhood, she'd been light on her feet. She remembered the joy of movement, the way music could lift you out of yourself. But that was years ago. Now, as Jeremiah's hand settled at her waist and he took her hand in his, she felt only fear. What if she stumbled? What if she couldn't keep up? What if— Then they began to move and everything else fell away. Jeremiah Cole, for all his rough exterior, danced with surprising skill. His lead was firm but gentle, guiding her through the steps with confidence. More than that, he seemed to anticipate her movements, adjusting his pace to match hers, supporting her weight so smoothly that she barely noticed she was being helped. Eliza's body remembered. Her feet found the rhythm, her skirts swirled, and suddenly she was dancing, truly dancing for the first time in years. The music poured through her like water, and she felt light, graceful, almost weightless in Jeremiah's arms. They went through the basic steps of the reel. Then Jeremiah began to add flourishes, a spin here, a dip there. Eliza followed perfectly, her body responding to his lead like they'd been dancing together for years instead of minutes. Her face, which had been tight with anxiety, bloomed into a radiant smile. Around the circle, mouths dropped open. People had expected a disaster, a humiliating spectacle. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary. Eliza Thornton moved across the floor with a grace that belied her size, her steps precise and sure, her turns smooth as silk. The music seemed to flow from her body rather than simply accompanying it. Jeremiah found himself genuinely surprised. He had issued the challenge to put the cruel men in their place, expecting only to prove that Eliza deserved respect regardless of her dancing ability. He had not expected this natural talent, this pure joy of movement. The woman in his arms was a revelation. "You've been hiding this," he murmured as they swept past the goggling Thomas Pritchard. Eliza laughed, a sound like bells. "No one ever asked me to dance before." "Their loss," Jeremiah said simply. The fiddle player, caught up in the moment, began to play with more enthusiasm. Other musicians joined in, a harmonica, a guitar, someone keeping time with spoons. The music swelled, and Jeremiah and Eliza matched its energy, their dance becoming more elaborate, more daring. Jeremiah lifted her, in a graceful arc that had the crowd gasping. But he was strong enough to make it look effortless, and Eliza trusted him completely, her arms extended like wings. When he set her down, they spun together in perfect synchronization, her skirts flaring out like a calico flower. The other townspeople began to clap in time with the music. Even those who had stood silent during the mockery found themselves enchanted by the unexpected spectacle. This was dancing as few of them had ever seen it, not just steps and patterns, but pure expression, two people moving as one. Thomas Pritchard's face grew darker with each passing moment. He had expected easy money and a chance to further humiliate Eliza Thornton. Instead, he was watching his sure bet crumble before his eyes. Beside him, Silas Granger looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. The song built to its crescendo. Jeremiah and Eliza spun faster, their movements perfectly matched, and then with a final flourish, he dipped her low, supporting her weight easily as the music hit its final note. They froze in that position for a heartbeat, both breathing hard, both grinning. Then the room erupted in applause. People surged forward, shouting congratulations and praise. The fiddle player wiped tears from his eyes. The mayor's wife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Henderson, pushed through the crowd to grasp Eliza's hands. "My dear girl," she exclaimed, "that was the finest dancing I've seen since leaving Baltimore. Why have you been hiding such talent?" Eliza couldn't answer. She was overwhelmed, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. Jeremiah stood beside her, a protective presence, his hand still at her elbow. Finally, the crowd parted enough for Thomas Pritchard to approach. His face was stiff with barely controlled anger, but he knew when he was beaten. The entire town had witnessed Eliza's triumph. To refuse payment would brand him a cheat and a coward. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out gold coins into Jeremiah's outstretched palm. Each coin clinked like a bell of judgment. "There's your money," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "Not finished yet," Jeremiah said quietly. His voice was soft, but something in it made Thomas go still. "You got something else to give the lady." "What?" "An apology." Jeremiah's pale eyes were arctic. "You and your friends. For every cruel word you've ever spoken to her, for every time you made her feel less than she is, you're going to apologize, and you're going to mean it." Thomas's face flushed red. "You can't make me—" Jeremiah took one step forward. Just one. But it was enough to make Thomas Pritchard take 2 steps back, stumbling slightly over his own feet. The mountain man didn't raise his voice, didn't make any threats. He didn't need to. Everything about him, his size, his scars, his absolute certainty spoke for itself. "I'm waiting," Jeremiah said. The silence stretched out. Every eye in the room was fixed on Thomas Pritchard. He looked around desperately for support, but even his friends wouldn't meet his gaze. Silas Granger was studying his boots again. The cowboys had mysteriously vanished. Finally, Thomas turned to Eliza. The words came out strangled, but they came. I apologize, Miss Thornton, for tonight and for other times. It was wrong of me." "And?" Jeremiah prompted. "And you dance beautifully," Thomas added, the admission clearly paining him. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to savor his humiliation, to let him twist in the wind the way he had made her feel so many times. But a larger part of her, the part that had just experienced the pure joy of dancing, chose grace instead. "I accept your apology, Mr. Pritchard," she said quietly. "I hope you'll think more carefully about your words in the future." Thomas nodded jerkily and fled, shouldering his way through the crowd toward the door. Silas Granger and the few others who had joined in the mockery shuffled forward, offering their own stammered apologies before following him out into the night. When they were gone, the mayor raised his glass. "To Miss Eliza Thornton," he called out, "the finest dancer in the territory." The crowd cheered and drank. The musicians struck up another tune, and suddenly everyone wanted to dance with Eliza. She found herself passed from partner to partner, laughing breathlessly, her earlier humiliation forgotten in the warmth of genuine acceptance. Jeremiah watched from the side of the room, a small smile playing at his lips. He had come to town to trade his furs and stock up on supplies before winter closed the passes. He had not expected to find himself defending a stranger's honor, and he certainly had not expected to find himself charmed by that stranger's courage and grace. As the evening wore on, he found his eyes following Eliza around the room. There was something luminous about her now, a confidence that had been unlocked by the dance. She glowed with it, and every person who danced with her seemed to catch some of that light. Near midnight, as the party began to wind down, Eliza finally made her way back to where Jeremiah stood. Her face was flushed with exertion, her hair escaping from its pins, and she had never looked more beautiful. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "You did the hard part," Jeremiah replied. "All I did was give you the chance. You did more than that." She held out a small embroidered handkerchief. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. Here, your winnings. That money should be yours." He waved it away. "Keep it. Consider it payment for the finest dance I've had in 10 years. 10 years? Eliza smiled. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" "Quebec, mostly. Spent some winters there in my younger days. The French know how to pass a long winter, dancing, drinking, and storytelling." He paused, suddenly awkward. "I'm heading back up to the high country in a few days, but I was thinking, if you're not spoken for, maybe I could write you when I come back down in the spring." Eliza's heart did a complicated little dance of its own. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Cole." "Jeremiah," he corrected gently. "Just Jeremiah." "Then I'm just Eliza." She held out her hand, and he took it carefully, his enormous palm cradling hers like something precious. They stood that way for a moment, the music swirling around them, both suddenly shy. Neither of them could have guessed that this night, this dance, would change both their lives forever. Winter came early that year, sealing the mountain passes by mid-November. Jeremiah made it back to his cabin in the high country just ahead of the first big snow, his thoughts full of a brown-eyed woman who danced like she was made of music. He had never been much for writing. His education was practical rather than scholarly. He could read well enough to follow a map or a fur trader's inventory, and he could write clearly enough to keep accounts. But letters of the heart were different territory, as treacherous as any mountain pass. Still, by the light of his fire, with wind howling outside and 2 feet of snow already on the ground, he put pen to paper. "Dear Eliza, I hope this letter finds you well. I made it back to my winter camp before the snow closed in proper. It's just me and the silence up here, which suits me most times. But lately I find myself thinking about fiddle music and the smell of pine needles warmed by lamplight. I've been trapping these mountains for near 15 years, and I thought I knew everything they had to teach me about beauty and grace. Then I watched you dance, and I realized I'd been looking in the wrong places. I'm not a man of fancy words, but I wanted you to know that the memory of that night has kept me warm, better than any fire. I hope I can see you dance again come spring. Respectfully yours, Jeremiah Cole." He sealed the letter with wax and waited for the thaw. It would be months before he could get it to town, months more before any reply could reach him. Mountain time moved differently than town time. Down in Redemption Creek, Eliza found her life transformed. The dance had changed something fundamental in how people saw her, and more importantly, how she saw herself. Mrs. Henderson asked her to teach dancing to the young ladies of the town. The general store owner, Mr. Patterson, began saving the prettiest fabrics for her. Even Thomas Pritchard crossed the street to avoid her gaze, which she counted as a blessing. But through all of it, she thought of Jeremiah Cole. She replayed their dance in her mind until she could feel the pressure of his hand at her waist, the confidence of his lead, the way he had looked at her like she was someone worth defending. When spring finally crept into the high country, and the first hardy travelers made their way over the passes, they brought Jeremiah's letter. Eliza read it by candlelight in her small room, tracing each carefully formed word with her finger. Then she took out her own pen and paper. "Dear Jeremiah, your letter arrived like the spring, thawing something that had been frozen for too long. I cannot tell you how many times I've read it, finding something new in your words each time. Life in Redemption Creek has changed considerably since that night. I now teach dancing 3 times a week, which fills my days with joy and occasionally sore feet. But the greatest change is in myself. You help me remember who I was, who I am. For that gift, mere words of thanks seem inadequate. I find myself watching the road from the mountains, wondering when you'll ride down. The town seems empty without the possibility of seeing you round the bend. Spring is truly here when you return to us. Come back safely. Yours, Eliza." So began a courtship conducted in careful words, carried by mountain men and traders, traveling salesmen and mail riders, letters crossed in transit, some taking weeks or months to reach their destination. But each one was treasured, read, and reread until the paper grew soft with handling. Jeremiah wrote about life in the high country, tracking elk through silent forests, watching storms roll across granite peaks, the profound solitude that could either crush a man or make him whole. He wrote about his past, too, things he'd never told anyone, how he'd lost his family to fever when he was young, how he'd run west to escape the memories, how the mountains had saved him by demanding all his focus and skill. Eliza wrote about her own history. Growing up in Virginia, her father's failed business, their journey west that had killed her mother and left her father a broken shell of a man. How food had become comfort when comfort was scarce. How her body had changed in ways that invited judgment rather than understanding. She wrote about her dreams too, not of being thin, but of being seen, of being valued for who she was rather than criticized for what she wasn't. "You see me," she wrote in one letter. "Not the weight I carry, not the size of my body, but me. That is a gift beyond measure." Jeremiah's response was characteristically direct. "Anyone who can't see past the surface to the treasure beneath is a damn fool. Pardon my language." She laughed when she read that, then cried, then laughed again. The summer brought Jeremiah down from the mountains twice, once in July to trade furs and again in September before the early snows began. Each time, he stayed in Redemption Creek longer than he needed to, and each time, he and Eliza found excuses to be near each other. They walked the perimeter of town in the cool evening air, their conversations ranging from practical matters to philosophical musings. They attended church socials, where Jeremiah endured being stared at with good humor, his focus entirely on the woman at his side. And they danced. Oh, how they danced! Every gathering that featured music found them on the floor, moving together with an ease that made them seem like one being rather than two. The townspeople whispered, naturally, about the mountain man and the large girl, about the unlikely match, about what it all meant. But the whispers were mostly kind, tinged with the wonder that comes from witnessing something unexpected and beautiful. By the fall of 1824, a year after the harvest dance, Jeremiah came down from the mountains with more than furs. He arrived on a crisp October afternoon, his pack horse laden with pelts, but his saddlebag held something more precious, a ring carved from mountain jade, polished to a deep green sheen. He found Eliza at the meeting hall, teaching a group of giggling young ladies the steps of a cotillion. He waited outside, watching through the window as she demonstrated the turns, her movements still graceful, still sure. When the lesson ended and the girls scattered, chattering like magpies, he stepped inside. "Jeremiah!" Eliza's face lit up like sunrise. "I didn't know you were coming down so soon." "Marry me," he said. The words fell between them like stones into still water. Eliza froze, her hand at her throat. "What?" Jeremiah crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hand. "I'm not good with pretty speeches, and I can't promise you an easy life. The mountains are hard, and I'm harder still, set in my ways after years alone. But I can promise you'll never be mocked or diminished again. I can promise you'll be valued and protected and cherished. I can promise that every time I look at you, I'll see the strongest, most graceful woman I've ever known." He pulled the jade ring from his pocket. "So I'm asking, plain and simple, Eliza May Thornton, will you marry me?" Eliza looked at the ring, then at his face, that weathered, scarred, earnest face, and felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst from her chest. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." Jeremiah's whoop of joy could be heard clear across town. He swept her up in his arms, all of her, easily, joyfully, and spun her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "I'll build us a bigger cabin," he promised, his forehead resting against hers. "One with room for dancing, and we'll come down to town when the weather allows. I won't make you live isolated like I've been." "Jeremiah," Eliza interrupted gently, "wherever you are, that's where I want to be. Mountains, town, or anywhere in between, as long as we're together." They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that brought out half the territory. Reverend Michaels officiated, Mrs. Henderson wept copiously, and even Thomas Pritchard attended, standing stiffly at the back and leaving immediately after the vows. The reception featured music, naturally, and the new Mr. and Mrs. Cole danced until the stars wheeled overhead. This time, others joined them on the floor, couples who had been inspired by their story, who had learned to look past surfaces to the depths beneath. As midnight approached, Jeremiah and Eliza slipped away from the party. They had a cabin waiting, newly built and spacious, with a smooth wooden floor perfect for dancing. But for now, they simply wanted to be alone together, to begin the next chapter of their unexpected story. "Happy?" Jeremiah asked as they walked through the quiet streets. Eliza squeezed his hand. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Good," he said simply. "That's how it should be." And in the starlight, they danced a few steps together, needing no music but the rhythm of their matched hearts. The first year of marriage was an education for both of them. Jeremiah's cabin, their cabin now, sat in a high valley accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. It was isolated, beautiful, and absolutely unforgiving to those unprepared for mountain life. Eliza, however, proved more adaptable than even Jeremiah had expected. The woman who had seemed so delicate at that long-ago dance was actually made of stern stuff. She learned to chop wood, to tend the trap lines when Jeremiah's work took him deeper into the high country, to read the weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of animals. She learned which plants were edible and which were poison, how to preserve meat for the long winter, how to make soap and candles, and 100 other necessities of frontier life. More than that, she transformed their cabin from a utilitarian shelter into a home. She sewed curtains from fabric brought up from town. She planted a garden in the brief mountain summer, coaxing vegetables from the thin soil. She brought music and laughter and warmth to a place that had known only survival. Jeremiah, for his part, discovered that companionship was not the burden he'd once thought it might be. He had grown used to solitude, had built his life around it. But Eliza's presence enhanced rather than diminished his days. She was easy to be with, comfortable in silence but engaging in conversation. She never complained about the hardships, never mourned the society she had left behind. And they danced. Even in that remote valley, far from fiddles and society gatherings, they danced. Jeremiah would hum a tune, something he'd learned in Quebec or picked up from French trappers, and they would move together across their cabin floor, creating their own entertainment, their own joy. The physical demands of mountain life changed Eliza's body over time. Hard work and limited provisions meant the weight she carried gradually shifted and reduced, though she never became thin. Jeremiah never commented on it, never suggested it mattered. He had fallen in love with her spirit, not her silhouette, and that remained constant regardless of physical changes. "You're beautiful," he would tell her, whether she was dressed for a rare trip to town or covered in garden dirt, whether she was soft from winter stores or lean from summer work. And he meant it every time. In the spring of 1826, nearly 2 years after their marriage, Eliza realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror. The nearest doctor was in Redemption Creek, 2 days' ride away in good weather. Women died in childbirth, even with medical care, and she would have only Jeremiah and perhaps a midwife if one could reach them in time. But when she told Jeremiah, his face split into such a wide grin that her fears receded. "We'll manage," he said firmly. "I've helped birth foals and calves and once even a bear cub, though that's a longer story. We'll make sure Mrs. Henderson comes up before your time, and we'll have everything ready." He paused, then added softly, "A baby. Our baby." He placed his large, scarred hand on her still flat stomach with a gentleness that made her cry. True to his word, Jeremiah prepared with the same thoroughness he brought to surviving mountain winters. He built a cradle from pine wood, carving it smooth as silk so no splinter could harm delicate skin. He stockpiled supplies, making extra trips to town despite the difficult journey. And 2 weeks before Eliza's time, he brought Mrs. Henderson and a midwife named Sarah Blackburn up to the cabin, along with enough provisions to keep them all fed for a month. "Just in case," he said when Eliza protested the expense and trouble. The baby came on a cold November night, arriving with the first snow of winter. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Jeremiah paced outside the cabin like a caged wolf, listening to Eliza's cries and feeling helpless for the first time in his adult life. But Mrs. Henderson and Sarah knew their business, and Eliza was strong. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the new snow rose and gold, a baby's cry rang out. "It's a girl," Mrs. Henderson called through the door. "A healthy girl, and your wife is fine, Jeremiah. You can come in now." Jeremiah burst through the door to find Eliza propped up in their bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. Their daughter had a shock of dark hair and her mother's warm brown eyes, and when Jeremiah first held her, his hands so large they could cradle her entire body, he wept openly. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're both perfect." They named her Grace for the quality that had brought them together, and her arrival completed something in both of them. The cabin that had been a home became a sanctuary, filled with the sounds of lullabies and laughter, baby cries, and cooing. Grace grew up in that high valley, as much a child of the mountains as of her parents. She learned to walk on the cabin floor where her parents danced, took her first steps to music hummed by her father and sung by her mother. By the time she was 3, she could identify animal tracks and tell edible plants from poisonous ones. By 5, she could ride a horse and help with simple trapline tasks. But she also inherited her mother's grace and her father's strength. And every night before bed, Jeremiah and Eliza would dance a few turns around the cabin, with Grace clapping in delight, or, as she grew older, joining in with her own childish steps. They made trips to Redemption Creek several times a year, partly for supplies, but mostly so Grace could have some contact with society. The townspeople adored her, this bright child who could track a rabbit but also curtsy properly, who could skin a fish but also quote poetry her mother taught her. On one such trip, when Grace was 7, they attended another harvest dance. The meeting hall looked much the same as it had on that fateful night 12 years earlier, though new faces had joined the old familiar ones. Grace watched in awe as her parents took to the floor. Jeremiah, now graying at the temples and carrying a few more scars, still moved with surprising grace. Eliza, her body changed by years and childbirth and hard mountain living, still danced like she was made of music. They moved together with the unconscious synchronization of long partnership, and the room fell silent to watch them, not in mockery this time, but in admiration. When the dance ended, Grace ran to them, bouncing with excitement. "Teach me to dance like that, please!" Jeremiah scooped her up easily. "Sweetheart, your mama's been teaching you to dance since before you could walk." "But not like that," Grace insisted. "Not the special dancing, the kind that makes people stop and stare." Eliza and Jeremiah exchanged a look over their daughter's head, one of those wordless communications that only long-married couples share. "That kind of dancing," Eliza said gently, "comes from the heart. Your papa and I dance that way because we're dancing together. When you find someone who sees you, really sees you, and loves what they see, then you'll understand." "But what if no one sees me?" Grace asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. Jeremiah set her down and crouched to her level. "Then they're fools, and you're better off without them. But someone will see you, Grace. Someone will see that you're brave and smart and kind and strong. And when they do, you'll dance together like no one else in the world exists." "Like you and Mama?" "Exactly like me and Mama." Grace considered this, then nodded with satisfaction. "Okay, but will you teach me the fancy steps anyway, just in case?" They laughed and agreed, and spent the rest of the evening showing Grace the turns and dips that had captivated a town all those years ago. As midnight approached and they prepared to head back to the boarding house where they were staying, Thomas Pritchard approached them. He was older now, his face showing the lines of a hard life. His father had died 2 years earlier, and Thomas had not managed the bank well. He was diminished, humbler than he'd once been. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole," he said formally, "might I have a word?" Jeremiah instinctively moved slightly in front of Eliza, old protective instincts rising. But Thomas held up his hands. "I mean no trouble. I wanted to apologize. Properly this time, not because a mountain man scared me into it, but because I've had years to think about what I did, what I said. Mrs. Cole, you were right to forgive me, though I didn't deserve it. I was cruel and small, and I'm sorry. Watching you and your husband tonight, seeing the life you've built, well, it puts a man's failures in perspective." Eliza studied him for a moment, this man who had once made her cry, who had tried to humiliate her at her lowest moment. She saw the genuine regret in his eyes, the hard-won humility. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Pritchard," she said finally. "What matters is what we learn from them. I wish you well." She offered her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas shook it. Then he nodded to Jeremiah, who returned the gesture with cautious respect and walked away into the night. "That was gracious of you," Jeremiah murmured. "You taught me that strength and grace go together," Eliza replied. "That night, you were strong enough to defend me, but gracious enough to let me choose how to respond. I'm just following your example." He kissed her temple. "How did I get so lucky?" "You asked me to dance," she said simply. "Everything else followed from that." They walked back through the quiet streets of Redemption Creek, Grace drowsing on Jeremiah's shoulder, the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. Behind them, music still drifted from the meeting hall, but they needed no accompaniment. Their hearts beat in rhythm, as they had since that first waltz, as they would for all the years to come. Years passed in the high country, marked by seasons and growth rather than calendar dates. Grace grew into a young woman as strong and graceful as her mother, as capable and fierce as her father. Eliza's hair grayed at the temples, and Jeremiah's shoulders finally began to show the years of hard work. But they still danced in their cabin, still moved together with the unconscious grace of long partnership. Other children came too, a son they named Samuel after Eliza's brother, and another daughter they called Rose. The cabin expanded, rooms added to accommodate the growing family. But the main room still had that smooth wooden floor, and it still saw dancing every night. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jeremiah and Eliza returned to Redemption Creek for one final harvest dance. Grace was married now to a young surveyor who saw her worth immediately. Samuel was courting a preacher's daughter. Rose, at 12, was already showing signs of inheriting her mother's dancing talent. The town had grown considerably, with brick buildings replacing some of the old log structures. But the meeting hall remained, a constant in a changing world. And when the music started and Jeremiah offered his hand to Eliza just as he had 2 decades earlier, the room fell silent in anticipation. They danced, not as spry as they once had been, perhaps, but with even more grace. The years had refined their partnership, worn away any rough edges. They moved as one being, telling a story in their movements of loneliness overcome, of cruelty defeated by kindness, of 2 unlikely souls who found completion in each other. When the dance ended, the applause was thunderous. But Jeremiah and Eliza barely heard it. They were looking at each other, seeing not the changes time had wrought, but the constant beneath, the courage, the strength, the grace that had drawn them together and held them close through all the years. "Happy?" Jeremiah asked, just as he had on their wedding night. "Happier," Eliza replied, just as she had then. "Always happier with you." They danced once more, as the stars wheeled overhead and their children watched and learned. And in that moment, they were ageless, weightless, perfect. 2 souls moving to music only they could hear, the music they'd been creating together since a mountain man asked a mocked woman to dance, and she found the courage to say yes. The song of their life together played on, measure after measure, season after season, a waltz that would continue until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. And somewhere in the high country, in a cabin with a smooth wooden floor, you can still hear it if you listen closely. The ghost of music, the echo of laughter, the sound of 2 people dancing through a life well lived.